Hi, my name is Penny Colpin. Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. I'm continuing with the series on better metaphors and analogies. Rather than focusing on illness and disease, there's any number of different examples and metaphors and analogies that could be used. Just want to remind people that I am not a medical doctor. I'm not providing medical advice, mental health advice. I'm just trying to share concepts and tools that helped me through the recovery from what I've always called a severe stress breakdown. I've used terms like ego collapse, moral injuries that triggered the shadow to explode, that type of thing. So anyway, moving on. Basically, when a structure fails, there's any number of reasons. Oh, forgot to say, if you like what I'm doing, please do subscribe, like, share, help build an audience. It'll make it easier for me to procure people who would like to be interviewed and help bring about change to the mental health system, which many people end up traumatized by, as I was. So continuing on, structural failures often start with one small piece that then leads to a larger, more catastrophic, like a sequence of events type of thing, where something builds and builds and builds in a certain place, and then it results in, it's kind of like the dam that has a little bit of a hole and then erodes out, which I shouldn't have mentioned because that's actually one of the analogies I'm going to talk about a little bit. But anyway, that it could be due to, like, if you're looking at a mechanical system, a part failure. Is that because of fatigue? It's because of maybe lack of maintenance. The materials involved are not designed for whatever it's being used for. Basically, somehow that system gets overwhelmed in some way. And that can be related to, is that part or is that piece being abused? Is it being neglected? To where it finally gives way. So an example, I remember years ago, and I forgot to look up just what year this was. I was born in Minnesota, grew up there. And one of the bridges collapsed over the Mississippi River, one of the interstate bridges. And when a bridge collapses, it's not like every piece of the bridge falls apart at the same time. There's different stresses involved, and parts get fatigued, parts need to be replaced. Sometimes the whole bridge, as part of a maintenance plan, needs to be replaced, which here in Montana, we joke about. Basically, we have two seasons, winter and construction. So in the summer, a lot of the bridges on the interstates got to get down to that one lane because there's some kind of maintenance being done. But if there's a failure, even in something relatively small, it can bring down the whole system. So that's something that, in my case, there were specific things that contributed to something that broke, that basically brought down that whole, if you want to call it mind, experience base, the ego collapse, that type of thing. I already mentioned a dam failure is the same kind of thing, that depending on the size of the dam, the materials involved in a dam. I'm thinking of the little Dutch boy, plugging the hole. Well, that's not a solution long term. If you notice something failing, there's certain actions to take. You might have to drop the water so that you can get to it and fix it, that type of thing. So again, if that's not monitored, if that's not being taken care of, that dam, if it ends up with some kind of small leak, it can proceed and cause a catastrophic failure. Now, that example for me, I was showing signs of severe stress for at least 2 years before the breakdown. I wrote an article for Mad in America on how in Europe, specifically in Germany, Liechtenstein, they talk about burnout and how people burn out and need to be on medical leave for maybe a few months even. I burned out a couple years before this so-called breakdown, or what some could call a psychotic break. I was showing signs of a problem long before that happened. And in fact, I mentioned in a different article from Mad in America about the one about honoring a birthday, that I worked in process improvement. I worked in quality assurance. And one of the slogans we worked to was defect prevention rather than defect detection. That is, prevent a so-called defect. I don't mean to say that humans are defects or anything like that. That's not the intent, but prevent this problem, which in manufacturing environments would be called a defective product. Prevent that rather than just create it and then weed it out and figure out that's wrong and then figure out how to dispose of it. But prevent the catastrophic failure from happening. And I was showing plenty of signs that something was wrong, but we weren't looking at enough different sources of stress in my life, and specifically the unhealthy dynamics that continued to grow even though I sought help from a psychologist and took stress management classes and all sorts of stuff. I still had the breakdown. And in that sense, if you want to call the breakdown the defect, I experienced the defect that never should have happened. Okay. Another example mentioned earlier with the Yellowstone floods, that it wiped out some roads. Basically, back in June of 2024, I woke up on a Saturday morning, and first thing I caught on the news was that the road going from Idaho over Teton Pass into Jackson, Wyoming, collapsed. Which to me, I've been over that pass many times. My folks had owned a timeshare in Jackson, Wyoming, and sometimes when I'd go down to use it, I'd head over Teton Pass instead of going down through Yellowstone. I had just been over that pass a year earlier, and it's a beautiful drive. And to look and think of, wow, that I guess to have experienced that place and think that, geez, this part of this road collapsed is really something. Before I started recording this, I looked into it a little bit more. That I remember them using terms like catastrophic failure. And I recalled that a few days before, there again had been some signs. There was a crack, and I think there was an unevenness of the asphalt of a few inches that covered both lanes. So there was an indication that something was wrong. What I didn't realize is that apparently just a couple of days before the road collapsed, they had gotten quite a bit of rain through there. One of the statements I came across, a couple miles away, they actually had a mudslide that covered part of the road and closed Teton Pass due to the mudslide a couple miles away. And I pulled up a couple of articles, and one of them basically said from the main engineer, one of the main engineers at the Wyoming Department of Transportation, is that the road collapse, even though they had determined a possible problem, they were monitoring it, they had the road closed, and assessing, the acceleration of the slide was caused by groundwater oversaturating the soil. The engineer didn't think that the collapse could have been prevented. And a quote that he says is, "We have lots of landslides we work on all the time. This wasn't a major concern at all. It hadn't really shown any strong instability, but then things changed, and they changed quickly." I wanted to mention that because in the terms of mentioning instability, they were familiar with some of these symptoms, if you want to call it that, some of these signs of instability and how to deal with it. And then things changed, and they changed quickly. So when you're dealing with a structure that shows some kind of instability, that can change quite a bit more quickly. And of course, for me, it did. One of the engineers mentioned that the accident was only a matter of time. And I had heard that at the time, that that they expected that road to fail at some point. They just didn't quite know when or how to deal with it. What was to me kind of interesting is that they were able to build a section of that road parallel to what fell. The way the curve was, and there was enough room that they built a temporary road through there and it reopened 3 weeks later. And I thought, wow. I was talking with some friends and I said, oh boy, that's good for them, but man, oh man, that seems like, and I think they had a really low speed limit going over it. And just as I looked it up, the end of July is when they finished the permanent road. So that also goes to is that when these things happen, okay, in this case, there was a temporary fix, but the permanent, dealing with it in a permanent fashion took over a year. So this idea of some kind of quick fix to some of these catastrophic mental events, it could take a year, 2 years, 3 years to mostly fully recover from the damage that's done. And especially if, as I mentioned in the previous video, if things aren't handled well and you actually cause more damage, then it means it will take even longer to recover from. I found it interesting when the Teton Pass collapsed because I was already thinking in terms of the Yellowstone floods from June of 2022 that wiped out several sections of the roads. Again, roads that I've been familiar with for decades. And I think at first you could think, okay, a road collapsed or a road was destroyed, and let's treat the road destruction. But then when you look at it, you need to understand the context of what happened. It's not just, so in terms of mental health issues, it's not just, oh, these behaviors are similar. You need some framework around it. So in Yellowstone, it was directly related to the water coursing down this river channel, and the road section I'm thinking of was right next to the water. And so it was the force of the river that took out the road. Whereas at Teton Pass, that was more of an erosion type thing, that it finally gave way a couple days later. I mean, yes, it was sped up due to the oversaturation, but it was something that was, the engineers said, were pretty much going to happen. So even though it's a road failure, the causes are different, which means how you treat it might be different. How you prevent that from happening again might be different. Now, even in the case of the Yellowstone road situation, they ended up, there was another road that went off in a different direction from Gardner towards Mammoth. It was apparently like even an old stagecoach road or something originally. And so the temporary fix was to beef that up so that the tour buses and cars, and you can see it when you go into Gardner, whereas the old road goes off towards the left and the new road goes off towards the right up into the hills. But my understanding is that they know that that is not a temporary fix because of the soil, and it's just not a stable enough bed for that road to be on long term. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not safe to go over, but they're talking 20, 30 years from now. They know it's not. So that's still a temporary fix. And they're, to my understanding, 3 years later, they're still trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? And I shouldn't laugh, but these are serious things. So yeah, for me, the concept of those road collapses are specific situations. But when I think in terms of an ego collapse or, the mind shattering, if you will, those are decent metaphors, decent analogies, and they lend themselves to better questions to understand what that process or what happened. Another metaphor analogy I use, I call it the Jenga model. For those of you familiar with the game of Jenga, that's where you have basically, I think it's like 54 small wood blocks. And you lay a base of, you have a form that you can put these in, but you have 3 blocks that go this way, 3 blocks that go this way, and then it builds up however many layers. And then you set up this tower of these wood blocks, and the game is to find the ones that are loose, and then you build up this tower even higher until it collapses. Now, the game of Jenga is different than the mental health process. I mean, of building out our experience bases and our models. It's but so the purpose of life isn't to have your mental, you know, abilities collapse, is what I'm saying. Jenga is, of course, a game, but to me, it goes to the idea that as we build out our models of the universe and our role in it, and we learn new things, we build upon foundations of our psyche, right? And so I think we end up moving some things around. Maybe we reevaluate something we thought we understood and decided to expand it out a little bit. And so as we build out this experience base, one, there are things that shift. So there are different stresses put on different things. And if you don't fortify some things, certain sections might give way. Similar to the avalanche, the layers where something happens at specific layers. But so for me, even the Jenga model, that when that tower collapses, it's no longer there in that same function. It's a mess. It's in a sense, there's violence that happens. There's the potential energy that you've invested in this structure. It turns into kinetic energy, if you want to look at it from the physics side. And for me, that's a decent metaphor to use for what I experienced. I did get a kick out of it. I came up with that metaphor a few years ago, and I do get a kick out of it. I don't own the game. I actually don't like playing the game, which is probably a subconscious thing that, no, I had my mind collapse. I don't like having all that noise and that clutter. But I think it's still the case where on the box, if you go to buy it, there were times where I'd be in a store and I'd turn my head and I'd see a Jenga game while I was kind of developing this model. I thought, nice. But on the box, it says, how do you Jenga? Which I think is kind of funny, weird, of how do I Jenga? Well, I've been through that Jenga process as a type of metaphor. Another case I look at, it's a different type of structural change or structural collapse. It's not necessarily affected by gravity. There's a scene in the movie Titanic, and I know I'm going back a ways, but keep in mind that in 1998, the movie Titanic had come out the year earlier. And in fact, when my friend Karen, whose soul I felt in Banff, and afterwards, when she died, my understanding, I wasn't at the memorial service, but it was the theme from Titanic that they played at her service, and it's the song My Heart Will Go On. Well, in addition, there was one item. Karen and a good friend of mine were neighbors. They shared a house that was split down the middle, so there were two apartments. There was one of Karen's items that was left in my other friend's apartment, and it was the movie Braveheart. And I found that interesting because it was with Karen's help and through this process that I developed a braver heart and even mind than I could have begun to comprehend beforehand. So stuff from Titanic had some significance to me, but there's a scene from the movie that shows as it's the violence of the ship sinking and all the water flooding in, but there's a scene that shows a series of rivets as they pop in sequence. And my understanding is that's called unzipping. I've heard it referred to with airplanes as well, that if there's a catastrophic failure, how I knew a guy who worked at Boeing who worked on their fastener program. And basically, even with the sources of stress and strain on some of those systems, even one fastener that fails, if it's not designed properly, if it causes this unzipping, of course, you lose the airplane. I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but that scene from Titanic played in my head, or something similar played in my head when I was in Banff, when I was afraid to get on a plane, convinced I'd be killed the next day in a plane crash. I get that wasn't rational. I get it. In fact, I've never been afraid to fly on planes except for that period of time. And even a week later, when I flew from Calgary back to Seattle, I wasn't afraid to get on the plane. But one of the scenes that played through my mind was a series of rivets unzipping like that and leaving, you know, leading towards a catastrophic failure of some type. So that could be a metaphor of even how things pop and separate, even though it might not be linear. That could be a metaphor or analogy. And finally, I think this one might make a few people laugh. I hope it does. Back in, I'm not going to tell you what it is until I get to it. But back in January of 2022, I'd gone to Europe for a few weeks. I was an exchange student to Germany, so I try and get over to visit my host parents at least once a year if I can. Been in Europe for a few weeks. I flew back to Seattle a couple days before Christmas, and then I was going to spend some time with some friends out near Seattle. That night that I flew into Seattle, that night in Bozeman, it got down to 40 below. That's not with wind chill, is my understanding. I'd asked my neighbors if they could keep an eye on my place. I'd seen that it was going to get really cold, and I asked my neighbor, hey, can you keep an eye on my furnace, or just, keep an eye on my place. And so the next day, I'm out in Seattle and I get a text and says, hey, check your email. Well, my furnace had gone out overnight. We talked to my neighbor and he said, I think we got it. It was cold in your place, but I was able to get the furnace going. It's warming up now. I'm going over to check it, and bless his heart, and he said, I think we got it because you had some like soda and like 2-liter soda bottles and some juice out in your garage, and that wasn't frozen. And he said, your water might be frozen. I said, no, I turned off the water before I left. So anyway, when I did get back to Bozeman after my time it was early January that I got back to Bozeman. Even when I first heard of this back close to Christmas, I called a former neighbor friend of mine who was a plumber and just said, is there anything I should look for? I mean, here I am kind of helpless out in Seattle wondering what's going on. And at the time I couldn't even fly back to Bozeman early because SeaTac was closed for a couple of days. And he said, well, as long as the water's off, here's some things to look for. So anyway, I get home, I go downstairs, down to the crawl space to turn on the water. It starts spraying a little bit of water, and I'm like, crap, turn it off. And called him. He said, I can't get over till tomorrow. I can replace that. It'll take about an hour. But I was going to be without water for the night. Okay, I can handle that. So later that evening, I go upstairs. I have a half bath on the first floor, and I have a 3/4 bath and a full bath upstairs. And I'd noticed in the 2 upstairs the toilets, that the water tank or the water level in the bowl seemed definitely lower than what it should have been. And then I thought, evaporation, what? And then later I said, boy, what's going on with this? And so in the master bath, I went and I took off the lid to the toilet tank, and the toilet tank fell apart in 5 major pieces. Wow, that caught my attention. I was like, holy cow, what happened? So then I went into the other bathroom. The downstairs bathroom didn't have, the water level in the bowl seemed fine. But the other bathroom upstairs, I then noticed, sure enough, that tank was cracked along the sides. And I thought, holy cow, what happened? And here it is, like 11 o'clock at night. I'm getting ready to go to bed. And I have to say, I had a hard time going to bed that night. I thought, how cold did it get in here? I mean, because those tanks, I would have guessed, definitely cracked because of, the water in the tank must have iced up, been cold enough to crack these tanks. And I thought, good Lord, how cold did it get that night? Thankfully, when my former neighbor came over, it could have been so much worse. He was able to fix things up. He was able to replace the spraying thing. And even the fact that when I turned on the water, it sprayed a little bit was a good thing, because it meant that I, turned off the water instead of going upstairs using the toilet, not realizing, and then flushing the toilet and ending up with water everywhere. Um, so thankfully he was able to fix things within a few hours, did some tests and that type of thing. It could have been much worse, could have been, problems with pipes in the walls and that type of thing. But so for me, even this analogy of cracked toilet tanks, that becomes an analogy of my experience, because it was actually a few days later that I was I have an upstairs bedroom that I sometimes play vinyl music, either 45s or albums, and I played the song Sledgehammer. And there's other stories I have about that song, but as it played, I realized, wow, that's part of why my nervous system has been a little bit tense over the previous few days, because I realized it was as though someone hit that tank, especially the one that fell apart in 5 pieces, like they hit it with a sledgehammer. That there was force involved in cracking that apart. Now, some people will say it doesn't really take that much force to break a toilet tank. I don't know, but it took enough. But the thing is those tanks didn't just break. There was something that happened that created a condition for them to break. And what we figured, my plumbing friend and I, is that we guessed that maybe where the fan for the 2 bathrooms, that maybe that vent got stuck open, or even if it didn't, that it just didn't have enough. But we wondered if it got stuck open, and so that cold air just funneled right in, down, basically above the toilets, and so that -40 degree cold air ended up funneling right in to those specific areas. But it is something that, as I think about that, and when I heard that song Sledgehammer, I realized in that context that it was as though that moral injury that hit my system was like a sledgehammer, and it caused that breakage, and it triggered that collapse process. So even something like cracked toilet tanks are, for me, a better metaphor, a better analogy than this idea that I have something like diabetes the rest of my life. Do you see how there's any number? I mean, if I can make an analogy out of cracked toilet tanks, you can make an analogy out of almost anything. So anyway, I did want to just share again. That's kind of a grouping of things that collapse, fracture, not necessarily just natural things, but structural failures, is another source of potential analogies that can be useful for people going through these ineffable processes that are so difficult to describe. So thanks for joining me. I hope you found that somewhat interesting, maybe even a little entertaining. But ultimately, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one.